all over the United Kingdom, in America and elsewhere. And yet, in the shadow of the Article 50 vote last night and all the publicity around that, something very interesting has happened in this country. Because Home Secretary Amber Rudd, overnight, has announced a change of policy. Last year, following an amendment put forward in the House of Lords by a man called Lord Dubs, who was a 6-year-old Jewish child who came to this country in 1939 from Czechoslovakia, and thank goodness he did, otherwise he wouldn't have made it through World War II. Dubs put forward an amendment saying, look, we should open our hearts to child refugees, and the government agreed we'd allow 3,000 child refugees in. And yet this is what Amber Rudd, our Home Secretary, said today.
The government has always been clear that we do not want to incentivise perilous journeys to Europe, particularly by the most vulnerable children. That is why children must have arrived in Europe before the 20th of March 2016 to be eligible under Section 67 of the Immigration Act. The Section 67 obligation was accepted on the basis that the measure would not act as a pull factor for children to Europe and that it would be based on local authority capacity.
So overnight, we've decided we're not going to allow 3,000 children to come into this country from Syria or elsewhere. The number now is 350. So I suppose you could say that the UK has brought in now its own travel ban. But the reasons they've done it, I think, need considering. Because it's the French government that have advised us that by allowing child refugees into this country, and I guess this could apply to refugees more generally, actually, we're making the problem worse. And what am I talking about by the problem being worse? Well, just have a think about this. The number of undocumented migrants who have drowned in 2016 trying to reach Europe is 5,000 people. In 2015, it was 3,770. So there are thousands of people now dying every year crossing the Mediterranean because they hope to get refugee status somewhere initially in the Schengen zone, within the European Union, and ultimately onto us. And the question, and it's a tough question, it's a difficult question, it's a moral question, particularly for one like us, a country that does have a long history of taking in refugees. And I speak as the descendant of Huguenot French Protestants who left that country because they were being massacred by the Catholics all those years ago. And I speak as somebody from a country who opened their hearts to 28,000 people from Idi Amin's Uganda, where he literally said he would kill all of the Ugandan Asians, and from a country that opened its heart up to Jews from Czechoslovakia like Lord Dubs and Austria and Germany. So nobody ever can criticise the United Kingdom for not being one that is prepared to take refugees. The problem is what we currently have with this exodus that we've encouraged across the Mediterranean, and it's been encouraged by Mr. Juncker from the European Commission, it's been encouraged by Chancellor Merkel of Germany. What we now have is a problem of a different order. It isn't just people fleeing fear of persecution and death. It is actually people falling into the hands of very aggressive, very dangerous traffickers. And there is strong suspicion that people are paying large sums of money to get young children to Calais so that they can then come in to the United Kingdom. And on that journey, yes, it's true, people are dying, people are being abused, and they're paying badly. So the difficult moral question that I'm asking you to answer tonight is that if we let refugees in, are we just adding to the problem by encouraging more to come? And I'm going to ask Matthew in Heathrow what he thinks of this question.
Hi, Nigel. Well, I work and I travel through Calais every night. And, I mean, the last few months, basically, there isn't any immigrants, child immigrants or refugees trying to get to the UK. Since the French closed the camp down, they're now all over France. And I think if they did start accepting more, then the Calais problem will start again. But the only reason they've sorted out the Calais problem is because of the upcoming election in France, why they've done that. And unfortunately, I suspect after the French election, the problem, they're going to just ignore it again and the problem's going to start in Calais.
Well, Matthew, I came through Eurotunnel yesterday, and I have to say, albeit there are lots of walls that have been built, or fences, not quite Trumpian, but fences that have been built. There is a bigger police presence than has ever been. I no longer feel intimidated driving my car into Eurotunnel, whereas over the last couple of years, once or twice, I've sort of gulped hard and put my foot down and kind of hoped for the best, because it's been really pretty scary there. But you're right, the jungle has gone. The jungle has gone, although for France the problem's not solved, because many have gone, of course, onto the streets of Paris. But really, Matthew, what the French government is saying, and clearly they've had a massive effect on Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, is that if you take lots of people, more and more will come. So do you think that what Amber Rudd has done is a rational decision?
Well, no, I think that's right. They shouldn't take them from. If they're in France, the French should be dealing with them and should be keeping them safe. It's the refugees what are in the countries where it's not safe.
Yep.
They're the ones possibly we should still, be charitable and open the door to.
Well, we can open the door, Matthew, and I thank you for your call, but of course one of the problems here is that traditionally refugee status was always claimed and perhaps granted in the first safe country that a person reached. And of course, almost by definition, anyone coming from Calais has been through a safe country first. Tony in Woodford, if we open our hearts to child refugees and other refugees, are we just exacerbating an already desperate problem?
Absolutely not. It's such a shame on Amber Rudd's mind. And, Nigel, where's your humanity? These children, I remember vividly 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe a bit longer, you nearly died in a plane crash.
Yeah.
And you that must have had an effect on you. These poor kids are 1 minute, in some cases, away from death at any time. We're big enough, we're rich enough to let thousands in, okay? We just got to police it and do it properly. It's a big mess all through Europe. It's been allowed to grow and deteriorate, and the criminals have got involved. If it was policed properly to begin with, let's show humanity towards these kids, because it's not their fault. They did not ask for these wars to start.
Well, Tony,
and
that's...
in many cases,
that's
American foreign policy, our foreign policy, that's instigated these problems.
Well, one good thing, Tony, is that with President Trump, that foreign policy has just been reversed. So I'm sure you'll be very pleased to hear that. But the logic of your argument, I mean, why not let in hundreds of thousands? Why not let in a few million? I mean, would you be happy with 2 or 3 million people coming in who are, in a bad place?
Nigel, I'm referring to the children. I'm not talking about 2 or 3 million. You're trying to whip me up into some type of argument, and I'm not going to fall for that.
Right. Well, let's say, Tony.
A lot of other people fell for it.
Well, let's say, Tony, that it's...
I've got a lot of time for you and respect you, but we're talking about children here.
Okay, but it's not 3,000, Tony, is it? I mean, the UNHCR, right? The UNHCR say there are now 60 million people who are currently displaced by war or other problems. Now, let's take a conservative estimate of that, and let's say 15 million of them are children. Now, the question I'm asking, Tony, is, we said we'd take 3,000. We've now reduced that to 350. But what to you would be an acceptable number?
I wouldn't even put a number on it. I would not put a number on it. Nigel, you're a very clever, articulate man. Why don't you get together with like-minded people like yourself in Europe and come up with devise a plan and a strategy and bring these kids in? They need to be saved. And all the arguing and all the pontificating and words don't mean anything. These kids could come here in their hundreds of thousands. Why not?
Well, Tony, this may surprise you, but I was the first elected UK politician to suggest that actually we should think about taking some Syrian refugees. And I particularly talked about the Christian community who literally were being murdered because of their religion. And as I said earlier, I come from a family that were refugees to this country. Tony, I'm not closed-minded to any of this, but I am conscious that perhaps we have to work out what a child actually means, and maybe even think about our definition of what a refugee is. I thank you for your call. A text coming in here. I voted Brexit, supported Trump, but this is wrong on every level. We cannot and must not close the door to such desperate and vulnerable children. And that comes in from James. The definition of refugees needs to be clearly redefined as the term has become corrupted and confused. That's from Helen Hims. Right now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. This is the front line of debate, and we're talking about a big change of government policy overnight. We were going to allow 3,000 child refugees to come into the country. That has been cut overnight to 350. Home Secretary Amber Rudd has said that the French are telling her the more people you let in, the more you encourage people traffickers. So I'm asking you, if we let in refugees, are we just adding to the problem? It is a big, emotive, contentious issue. I want to hear from you, whatever your view. To get involved, call me, please. 0345 60 60 973. Text me at 84850. Tweet me on @LBC. Don't forget the hashtag Farage and LBC. And please, watch the show live on LBC's Facebook page. Now, I think it might be useful for us to perhaps just think about what is a refugee, let alone a child refugee, but what is a refugee? Who qualifies? And we need to go back to the 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees as defined by the United Nations. And it is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality. That was the definition of what a refugee was for years and years and years. And I understood it, and I accepted it, and I think we as a nation did more than any other country in Europe to try and help people who were in trouble. But the problem came in 2015. It came with conflicts that had erupted in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria and elsewhere, that saw the beginning of a tide of people who wished to cross the Mediterranean. And I involved myself early in that debate, and here's what I said.
So we decided that people can come and that people won't be sent back. Now, I suspect that it's a shock, it will be a hell of a shock, to many European citizens, including the British, to understand that we've already agreed a common European asylum system. And what today is about, and today's resolution, is the direct implementation of it. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry, we simply can't accept countless millions.
Well, I stand by absolutely every single word of that. What the European Union did, what Mr Juncker did, was to redefine refugee status that we understood from 1951, and then Angela Merkel added to that by saying, as many of you as want to come can. And that's why we've had the camps at Calais. And that's why the British government thought it had to say yes initially to 3,000 child refugees, which it then reduced overnight to 350, and the French telling us this is the right thing to do because all we're doing is playing into the hands of criminal traffickers, gangs, and leading to more and more people drowning in the Mediterranean. The last caller said, was I being heartless? Where was my humanity? I would argue that stopping people taking dangerous journeys in the hands of criminals, stopping people drowning, actually was the right approach, and no country has given more money to help displace people from the wars in Syria and Libya than the United Kingdom. I'm not against at all us helping people at source. Your Facebook messages coming in. Sean Mulcahy says, let Merkel deal with it, she caused it. Well, many would agree. Chris Farmer says, for every child that comes in, it'll be followed by 20 members of its family within the next 3 years. Ray Porter says, the last terrorist attack in this country was in 7/7. 3 out of the 4 terrorists were born and raised in this country, so why penalise the children? Well, Ray, We're not even discussing terrorism tonight. We're not even discussing security. What we're talking about is the well-being of the individuals who are looking for a better life. And the question I'm asking you is, if we accept refugees, child refugees, do we just add to this tide of human misery? Martin in Glasgow, what do you think about this proposition?
Good evening, Nigel. Nice to talk to you. I am fed up listening to these bleeding heart liberal lefties that seem to come on a lot of these programmes. How can't they see you cannot accept millions of people coming? I'm talking about any country. Millions of people get into a country. And for our own country, for example, the national health is in its knees. We keep hearing about housing, but any time I hear housing discussed, none of these pious MPs who talk about it, none of them say, well, it's because of the immigration. That's why we've got a housing shortage. Anybody can clearly see that in their right mind. And how the heck these people who say, oh, take them in their thousands. I would like to see some of these people who phone in taking in some of these people. And an example is Nicola Sturgeon. I think she said she would take in some. Well, I'd like to see her taking some into her house instead of talking about it.
Well, quite. No, I mean, she'd never do that. But, Martin, there is a difference here. That, the problems that you're talking about, with access to the NHS and school places and jobs and all the rest of it, that is about sheer numbers coming into this country. So the point here is that legal net migration is running at 250,000 plus net every single year. What we're talking about here is refugee status. And actually, those numbers are tiny compared to what we're legally allowing into the country.
Yeah, and I accept that. But the point is, we're Saudi Arabia and these other Arab countries, where they're not taking any in. It's always the onus in the West to take in these situations where they're not doing nothing.
They've literally, Martin, done nothing. And I can tell you that Saudi and Qatar and Kuwait have refused to take one single person who's been displaced by war in Syria or Kuwait or Iraq or anywhere else. And you are absolutely right, Martin, about that. The question is, literally, refugees are a small part of this bigger argument about numbers coming to Britain. But if we encourage people to get to Calais and then legally, or perhaps in many cases illegally, to get to Britain, are we just making this situation worse? Are we adding to the tide of human misery? Are we putting money into the coffers of the criminal gangs? That's really the question.
Well, that's it. Exactly. People are quite rightly in many ways going to say, right, we can get into Britain, let's go for it. Because they know Britain's got its national health and all of it. Why would you have a camp in France? I know I'm going on a wee bit about immigration here, but why would you have a camp in France to go to Britain where you could quite equally go to France or a country near where you came from? And as for that Merkel you mentioned, I think she should be in prison for the nonsense that she's come away with. It's a disgrace, and she's caused a lot of this trouble.
Well, she has made, Martin, a catastrophic error of policy. And I was stunned to see this week that Martin Schulz, who I opposed in the European Parliament for years as the leader of the Socialist Group, who was president of the European Parliament for 5 years, not my biggest fan, is now leading the opinion polls in Germany. So unpopular is Merkel. Martin, I thank you very much for your call. Facebook messages. Nicola Rand says, what about looking after British children first? And Kearney says, we can't afford any more. We are massively in debt and social care is in crisis. Tom Mason says, we have plenty of kids in care who need help. What about them? Well, tweets, there should be no refugee aid until we help our own homeless, and on it goes. And it's very interesting. This country has never been close-minded to genuine refugees, but I put it to you that genuine refugees are people who fit in with that 1951 definition of what a refugee is. And I'll remind you, a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. These are genuine refugees. We've recognised this for years. We've now widened the bounds to say that it includes people who come from regions that are troubled by war or conflict. Well, the UNHCR say there are 60 million of those. And my friend Mr. Juncker, who sometimes before lunch makes the odd cogent point. And he said that perhaps we should open our hearts in Europe to people who come from poor countries. Well, that would be, by my estimation, somewhere between 3 and 4 billion people who then would be eligible to come. We've widened the definitions too far, in my opinion. I wonder what Jay in Tottenham thinks about this vexed question.
Hello, Nigel. How you doing?
Hello, fine.
Good. Now, I want to very quickly analyse your definition of a refugee, because you quoted the 51 Convention, which you're absolutely right. It is a person who's been persecuted on reasons of race, religion, nationality, political group, or nationality alone. But you missed out a chunk of the definition, which comes literally right after that, which is that it's a person who is unable or owing to fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or a person who is unable to return to that country owing to such fear and is unwilling to return to it, which in my opinion would quite accurately describe the refugees in Calais at the moment. But I have to question you though, Nigel, under what circumstances? Because I know you mentioned what you said in the European Parliament. I do actually if I'm being quite honest, I do mostly agree with what you say in that regard.
Sure.
But even if you don't wish to take the issue of poverty into account, I still don't quite understand how the people in Calais could not be considered refugees, to be quite honest.
Well, they are, in most cases, 60-70%, they are young males under the age of 30. Very few come from Syria anyway. They come from countries all over the world, and they are people seeking economic advantage. They want to have a better life. I don't blame them, Jay, one little bit for that, but I think we have to actually understand that we're perhaps potentially being taken advantage of. And you're right when you talk about the full definition of this. Yes, there are people who would qualify as refugees who fear going back to where they come from, but we have to somewhere get this right. We've broadened it, Jay, in my opinion, far too wide. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively here on LBC. In response to Home Secretary Amber Rudd reducing the number of child refugees this country will take from 3,000 to 350, I'm asking you a basic question. Is the acceptance of refugees making a huge problem of people trafficking and those drowning in the Mediterranean even worse? But before I get back on that, I must just return to my great theme of the week. My favourite hypocrite of the week, of course, has been John Bercow, man who broke the neutrality as Speaker of the House of Commons, and we had a big debate on that earlier this week, and I'm pleased to say that opinion polls did back up our majority view on this programme, that indeed he had overstepped the mark. And now, a backbench Conservative MP, James Duddridge, has agreed with us. He says Bercow has overstepped the mark, and he's put down a motion of no confidence in the Speaker. Now, MPs will be in recess next week because it's half-term, but by the time they come back, they've got the chance to sign this motion of no confidence. And Duddridge says, to be frank, I think there's a real possibility that once the level of discontent is known and Speaker Bercow sees the writing is on the wall, he will go of its own accord. So whether that is wild optimism from James Duddridge or whether Speaker Bercow is finally on the way out, we will see. But it's a story that I feel closely attached to. I'm so angered at what he did. And when we had a constitutional expert on that evening, he said nobody in 700 years had broken speaker neutrality quite as badly as Bercow had. Now, your texts and your tweets and your Facebook messages are coming in droves on this question of is accepting refugees making the problem worse. Let me give you a flavour. On Facebook, Glenn White says, the bottom line is children need their own culture and understanding. They should go back and be protected under UN law. Why isn't this happening? Why can't the UN police these war-torn areas? Maria Day says, where were the young girls amongst the children, in inverted commas, taken from the Calais jungle? How have young children found their way from one continent to another? Too many unanswered questions. Tom, Facebook's in, has Yvette Cooper taken in any refugees yet? Thought not. Hypocrites. Because you're right, Tom. She said she would. I thought that they were going to fill their house up with them. They've done nothing. Text Nigel, I live in a deprived area and the levels of homelessness have skyrocketed in the past few years. I'm all for helping genuine refugees, but we have to look after our own first. Callum from St Helens. Nigel, as usual, you are talking good, sound common sense. Why do some people want to argue with you? It beats me, says Tom in Bromley. And let me tell you, these messages are coming in on Twitter, on Facebook, by text, and virtually nobody is saying what the Home Secretary has done overnight is wrong. I want to hear from you if you've got an entirely different opinion. But at the moment, overwhelmingly, people think that the Home Secretary has got this right, that if we encourage refugees, we encourage trafficking, we encourage bad people, and we encourage yet more human suffering. I wonder what Michael in Canterbury makes of this vexed question.
Well, yeah, you say it's a basic question, and I'll give you a basic answer. Yeah, it probably does encourage a lot of refugees to make a journey. It is dangerous. But then again, I think they probably try and make that journey even if, like you said, no, none of you coming in. Like, I think they try and do it anyway. It's like we've had it in America for years, and you've heard like loads of Mexican people saying, even if Trump builds the wall, like, no, we'll find a way around, we'll get in somehow. And I think that would happen here.
Well, Michael, that may be true. And certainly there are significant numbers of illegal immigrants getting to the UK every single day in the backs of lorries and everything else. But I think the point is, Michael, that if you build barriers and you build walls and you make it tougher, fewer people surely get through.
That is true as well. But I suppose the way I think of it, it's like if we coordinate the refugee movement, then they won't need to come over illegally. What we always need to do, like, is have all European nations are, okay, right, so France is going to take this many, Britain's going to take this many. Oh, look, there's some room over in this bit of Germany. Like, okay, we'll send this little guy over here. It needs to be like that.
Well, Michael, that in theory would work, but of course in practice what has happened is Mrs Merkel has so angered countries like Hungary and elsewhere that they're saying we will not go along with the European Union's migrant quotas, we'll make our own decisions. So it's become actually a hugely contentious issue within the European Union. We, of course, were never part of the Schengen area. We're leaving the European Union. So what the Home Secretary has done overnight, she was free to do without contravening European law. But, Michael, where I'm with you is I'm not against us taking genuine refugees, and it's why...
Good on you, son.
No, absolutely. And I've made the case for the Christians, the Christian community, who literally, in the Middle East today, have absolutely nowhere to go. And their numbers have been massively reduced. They're being murdered for who they are as a religion, which I would have thought, under the UN Convention, going back to 51, meant they should have been top of our list. And do you know what, Michael? We haven't taken a single one. Indeed, when I've argued for the Christians, I'm told by Juncker, and indeed I was told by Cameron, that religion should have nothing to do with it. Well, history tells us, from Alf Dubs being a Jew in the past, it's got everything to do with it. So, Michael, I'm not against taking some refugees, but I need to know that they are refugees. Is that fair? Is that reasonable?
That is fair. The only problem I'd say with that, I think it would be impossible to police. Put it this way. It's like you've got lots of cases where at the airports you'll have like refugees coming in and presumably refugees, they might be economic migrants, and then they'll ask for the passport and the papers, and they can just so easily say they are trying to come in illegally. They can say, oh yeah, I forgot my passport.
Oh, I know, they all do that.
With that, I think I'm sure I don't know the numbers. I know there are people who do it. So for that reason, I think it would be impossible to police. You don't know who has legitimately forgotten their passport because they're busy running from a war zone.
I know. Michael, none of this is easy. None of it. And I thank you for your call. And the other point that's not easy is we were talking about child refugees. And I tell you what I think one of the reasons Amber Rudd has cut the numbers overnight is not just because the French have said it's leading to trafficking. It's because the first batches of people that we took in, clearly many of them weren't actually children. In fact, looking at some of them, I think if I was to sort of perhaps, dye my hair a bit darker, I might have got in, and the way the government does this is our officials only challenge the age of child migrants if they look to be over the age of 25. Well, at 25, I was married, I had kids, a mortgage, and a job. So I think actually one of the reasons that Amber Rudd has done this is that many of the people, too many of the people, and whether that's 5% or 10% or 20%, but too many of the people that came in the first batches of child migrants clearly were not children. And I think she was worried that the public would see, frankly, they're being taken for a ride. Thank you. I ask Emeka from Mill Hill. Emeka, what do we do about refugees? If we let them in, do we make the problems worse for everybody?
Hi, Nigel. That's not the question I want to address, at least not directly. I want to address a few things that you have said in the past, including today. I really appreciate it if you don't interrupt me. A few years ago, when I lived in Nigeria, while I was studying law in Nigeria, I came across a newspaper article by a journalist. It was at a time when a lot of Nigerians were refused visas to come over here to visit. He wrote an article and he quoted a book from somebody, and it was something about the ethics of the lifeboat theory. Now, this was a Nigerian journalist defending the British High Commission then in Nigeria, saying, listen, if there is a boat in the sea and that boat is sinking, and there are 10 lifeboats, and those lifeboats can take just 10 people, if you pick one more person from the sea because he's drowning and put him into any of those lifeboats, the lifeboats will sink because of the 11th person. So the British economy is really stretched, and it's all well. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, but Emeka, what I'm talking about here is a basic question. That if we accept refugees, whether it's in this country, whether it's in the European Union Schengen zone, isn't surely what we're doing encouraging those boats to come and encouraging a greater need of lifeboats?
That you tell on a daily basis. You said a few minutes ago to a caller that the Arab states, you quoted Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, have taken not one single Arab refugee. It's on record. It's what you said.
Yes.
Just like but Nigel, you know very well that is not true.
Whoa. Sorry, I'm sorry.
It is not true. Nigel, every authority in the world that is responsible for giving out the figures have said repeatedly that these Arab states take refugees, but they are not called refugees. I'm quoting from an Amnesty International.
Well, Emeka, I'm sorry. But let's just think about perhaps Saudi Arabia, who have said we will not take any refugees from the Syrian conflict because we're concerned about the effect on the balance of our society that they may have. And that's a fact. Emeka, if you've got any other questions, you can write into me. I will do my very best to answer them. But right now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage. Here on the front lines of open debate, we're asking whether letting refugees in adds already to the tide of human misery. And I've already explained to you that I think we should be able to open our hearts to genuine refugees. And I get a tweet in from Jack Walker, who says, Farage has just said on LBC that he wants the UK to take refugees on the strict condition that they are Christians. What an arse. Thanks, Jack. You're quite right, Jack. Let's let them all be murdered. Let them all be murdered because they're Christians. Then there won't be a problem, will there? We won't need Jack to discuss this in 2 years' time because they'll all be dead. How about that? Your Facebook messages also chunking in. Graham says, many so-called children seem to be adults who have already come into our country. They must think we're fools. Don't be fooled again. Graham, I think that's one of the reasons that Amber Rudd has done what she's done today. We saw the people coming in last time. I mean, half of them looked about 35, in my opinion. And we know the authorities won't even challenge somebody's child status unless they look over the age of 25. And please, I am not devaluing the horrendous things that are going on in the Mediterranean and in large parts of the Middle East. I am not being cold and heartless, but I genuinely think that EU foreign policy, which really began properly with this brand new asylum policy of their own, has led directly to thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean. The Australians faced this. Back in 2008, the boats were coming to Australia, lots of people were drowning, and the Australians said, none of you will get refugee status in this country if you come via that method, and the boats stop coming and people stop drowning. And I think the Aussies are onto something, but I wonder what Adam in Walthamstow thinks.
Hi, Nigel. Great fan, although I don't agree with everything that you say.
Well, no, Adam, no two human beings could ever agree with everything somebody else says, of course. But what about this question?
Well, the thing for me is, look, we're debating on refugees and saying, should we let them in? What should we do with them? What defines a refugee? Fine. But the point is, we as Britain have decided to intervene in their country, in Syria, or wherever we have. The thing is, when we actually do that, do our politicians, I don't come from a politics background, you do, do we not think, if we're going to affect the country so much, are we not going to think about the restoration and the rebuilding of their country if we're going to intervene? I think that's something which is, really important before we decide to do any action.
Adam, Syria,
think of this?
Syria we haven't intervened in directly, but your basic point is a very powerful one, that we have intervened in Afghanistan, we have intervened in Iraq, we have intervened very badly in Libya. And Adam, actually, you're right. We did cause a part of this problem, which perhaps weakens my argument in saying we shouldn't take people, given that we're partially responsible for what's happened. But what I'm arguing, Adam, is that we actually help people where they are, in their countries, where the problems are, and that if we say you can come, all we do is we hand these people over to the hands of the traffickers, and we see these tragedies happening in the Mediterranean. Adam, this is not an easy question, and I'm not here to defend British foreign policy, but I honestly, can we really allow these drownings, 5,000 people, innocent people, drowning in the Mediterranean last year? Surely we have to stop that.
I think we definitely do. But I think if we're going to do anything in any country, we have to think about how we're going to rebuild it. We've got to look. We give a hell of a lot in foreign aid, don't we? But
yes.
Do we actually look at where that money goes? Do we actually, look at it in a balanced, organised way? Do we say where is everything going? Do we account for everything? I don't think we do. And I think instead of just giving everything to the organisations, maybe we should have some kind of checks or a way of monitoring everything rather than just giving money blindly. I think that's incorrect in every single way. So we have to kind of have some procedures and controls in place, and also just think twice before we do anything and see what the consequences might be. Because, if we're having people pouring into our country, then, that's maybe it's been a consequence of our actions.
Adam, I think your point about the foreign aid budget and where it goes and why it goes there is a very powerful one. It'd be interesting to hear what Nick Ferrari on The Breakfast Show made of that point. He's been one of the biggest critics of our foreign aid budget and the way in which it's been spent. Adam, I think, has said something pretty sensible on that. Katie Ryan asks me, what's the difference between a Christian child refugee and a Muslim child refugee? Why would you help Christian children but not Muslim ones? I'm sorry, Katie Ryan, for any children that are displaced or having an horrendous time in the countries they come from. But the argument I'm making is that Christian children in those countries and Christian people in those countries are literally being murdered because they are Christians. And that, I think, goes to the absolute heart of what the 1951 UN Declaration on Refugee Status stands for. Yes, there are lots of people, Katie, in the world having a bad time in bad places. But, the Jews ultimately were killed because they were Jews. And it's why we let people in from Czechoslovakia, from Austria, from Germany. And I think that's what's happening to the Christians in many parts of the Middle East today. And quite why the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is supposed to be the head of our church, refuses to address this issue is absolutely quite beyond me. Barry Day says on Facebook, they should have been taken care of by the first EU country they arrived at. Why are these kids on their own? Anyway, Barry, your basic point, again, you're supposed to claim refugee status in the first safe country you come to, but all of that has gone completely out of the window. Syra in Buckinghamshire, what do you think about this difficult and vexed question?
Nigel, it's probably the first and the last time that I'll be listening to your show. But I think where you've confused things is you've asked way too many questions. You've confused the whole thing about child refugee and refugees in general. And I think that's where your listeners are just getting a little bit trigger happy about the whole thing about, let any refugees into the country. What your original question was should have been addressing what Amber Rudd has done, which is, I think, what your was. So I think you wanted to talk about whether we should be accepting child refugees or not. And I absolutely think that we should be, and I don't think that will be making the problem worse. And I'll tell you why. If we accept these kids, we're just going to be sending a message that we understand where you are coming from. There are bombs going off in your country. You know what? Come to ours. There are no bombs going off here. We will look after you. You're talking about such a small number has been reduced to literally nothing. Where on earth do you think these children are coming from? They fit very clearly into the definition that you gave, whatever definition that was in the 1950s. They fit the criteria. Yet, for some reason, because you're confusing the whole issue about maybe economic migrants and older refugees, perhaps, if that's, I have my own views about that. But, the point is, you were talking about children refugees, and for some reason you just seem to have twisted the whole thing and turned it into, we will just make the problem a lot worse.
Well, Syra, I'm going to really surprise you now. I'm going to really surprise you. I don't think the confusion is between child refugees and refugees. I think the confusion is between refugees and immigration. I've picked that up tonight, and I thank you for your point. And I ask you just to listen to what I'm about to say, because my final thought on this very vexed and difficult issue is this. I have absolutely no problem with us being a civilised country that takes in genuine refugees. I've never, ever had a problem with it. The difficulty is that because legal immigration is running at a net 1/3 a year, we've just had enough of the sheer numbers coming to this country, and we've closed our hearts, even to those who potentially might be genuine refugees. We're worried about people taking the mickey out of the system. Get legal immigration out of control, and then perhaps we can think properly about taking genuine refugees into Britain. And Syra, you and others, I think, will be happy with that policy. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show on LBC.